Hello, Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. The big and the hard questions sometimes too. And my name is Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon, and I'm a philosopher from the University of Texas at El Paso.
And today our guest is Suzanne Ramirez, who is a native El Pasoan and currently an assistant professor of government at El Paso Community College. She has attended the University of Texas at Austin, the Political Science Institute of Toulouse, France, and the University of Pittsburgh. She returned to El Paso in 2016 and has been serving in higher education ever since. So Suzanne, thank you for joining us today. Excited to have you.
Me.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here with you guys.
We'll get started. By what features do you think that we can distinguish a democracy?
Well, maybe we can define it broadly and then understand that there will be some criteria, because if we look around the world, we will see that democracy takes on all kinds of shapes. Democracy in the United States is going to be different from democracy in Canada, democracy in France, democracy in other places. If we define it broadly, what is it? It's a form of government in which the people govern. So the essential idea of democracy is that people have the ultimate authority over who governs them. Right? They have the right to determine who governs them. And so that's how we can define it broadly. And how do we recognize what it is? So the idea of popular sovereignty, again, that the people decide who's in charge, who governs them. You have countries that are recognized as democracies protect not only political rights, but what we call civil liberties, and I think we can unpack that a little bit more. Also, typically they're associated with well-being. If we look at, there's what we could call the temple of democracy, which includes all of those things based on rule of law systems and respect for democratic institutions. And so those are some of the key features that you're going to see in, well, those are the key features that you would see in a democracy. And I did an exercise for the purposes of today. There's an organization called Freedom House. And Freedom House is international in scope, and what it does is it releases yearly reports on what is the state of democracy and political systems. Really, what is the state of freedom? Hence its name, Freedom House. What is the state of freedom around the world? And so it looks at it looks at really the nearly 200 countries and writes pretty in-depth reports about what the state of freedom looks like. And they track political rights, and they track civil liberties. And they score countries out of 100 with 40 points on the political rights area and 60 points on the civil liberties area. And they have data sets that you can freely download and look at. And so I looked at just because of basic, if we study democracy, we know that a basic criteria, a basic feature will be free and fair elections, so electoral systems. And out of the 200 or so countries that are in the world, we have 110, to the data that I looked at from Freedom House, 110 that have electoral systems. So these countries could be seen as having the minimum criteria to be recognized as a democracy. But then if we expand to include civil liberties countries that protect, not only have in the books to protect civil liberties, but actively enforce and protect civil liberties, and those countries are grouped into free, partly free, and not free. And so then Freedom House has, by looking at that data, around 84 countries that would register as not only having electoral systems, but also strong protections for civil liberties. So then it's like a broad picture, right? What does democracy look like in the world?
Great.
Well, rather than sticking to our list, let me follow up on what you just said. So can you give us some examples of what you mean by civil liberties and some of the countries, for instance, that would have civil liberty protections but don't have, kind of a full-bodied democracy with free and fair elections or something like that. So what is meant by protection of civil liberties?
So let's look
in
at
that case?
protections of civil liberties. So that would be, if we look here in the United States, if you look at the Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. Those very essentially are civil liberties, freedom of speech. So in the First Amendment, you have freedom of speech, right? The right to free expression, freedom of religion, the right to free press, or freedom of the press, the fair trial, right? Fair search and seizure, all the amendments that recognize your right to fair due process, to the due process of law. And then we have the 14th Amendment, which says equal protection under the law, and that each state is obliged to recognize these civil liberties. So that's what we mean by civil liberties, is these basic protections of, with freedom of expression really being, the ultimate civil liberty in a democratic country.
I know I'm going down a rabbit hole here, and perhaps we'll get too far afield, but we'll come back.
And I don't want to stray too far from those great questions.
Yeah, I know, but these civil liberties, I think, is an important point, especially when you got to the point you're making about free expression being the ultimate, right? And so, how does that work, even in a full-bodied democracy like ours, with something like censorship? Because states apply censorship unevenly, actually, across the United States. And if free expression is kind of like the ultimate, how do our censorship laws then conflict with that kinds of censorship practices?
Well, so I had two thoughts on that. One is the idea of academic freedom.
Yeah.
It's so that you, in a democratic country, in a democratic system, you, the pursuit of truth, the ability to engage in research, inquiry, dialogue, to follow where the questions lead you without fear of censorship. Right? That's a hallmark of a democratic system. Once you move into where you are being actively censored, or you cannot say certain things, then maybe we're blurring that line. Then what does it mean to have academic freedom, or what is censorship? But the freedom of speech, we know, isn't absolute either, right? Our freedoms aren't absolute in that where we infringe on others' rights, or where we're causing harm to others, or in freedom of speech where we might be inciting violence, that freedom might not be protected, right? Because again, the idea of freedom in a society is that we abide by rules, and we have a rule of law system that undergirds these democratic freedoms that we abide by in order to protect not just freedom for me, but freedom for you and everyone else.
Right.
Why, we'll come back to this, why it seems, I personally find it fascinating, but why is it important for us to think about democracy? Because, we're burdened with so many things, like paying the bills and making it to the doctor and making sure the kids' lunch is packed, right? And making sure the kids did their homework, all this. So why should the average person think about democracy?
Do you mean by that, why should they study democracy, or why should we be engaged in democracy?
Just think about it, think about it. And then, of course, from there, study it or be engaged. But minimally think about it. Because I think a lot of us, are just, I think let the government professor think about that, and teach the class, and then if I care, or I'll sign up for that class. But other than that, it's, show up to vote. But I feel like, I really do personally believe that in order for the democracy to work, we have to do more than just show up to vote every 4 years, right? So, but why is it important for us to think about it?
You bring up a point, right? Democracy is not just about voting. The democracy requires participation. I think it's important to think about it because we have to understand what democracy is and what it isn't. How do we recognize democracy, and if we think about democracy, then we can think critically about what is the state of our democracy, and it maybe helps us recognize when we're in trouble or when maybe things aren't going so great. Robert Dahl, I lean on him because he was a preeminent political science of democracy and theorist of democracy, and he wrote a book called On Democracy. In there he talks about we can recognize that there's ideal democracy, right? The perfect political equality for everyone, the perfect protection of civil liberties for everyone, but it's really hard to attain perfection. But we can recognize what's the gap then between what does our actual democracy look like and what's the gap between that and the ideal. And I think if we're not thinking about it, then one, we might not even know to recognize what exactly democracy is and what it isn't. Mm-hmm. What's the alternative? What do non-democratic forms of government look like? Because if we can define democracy as protecting political rights and equality and protecting civil liberties, then we can recognize that non-democratic forms of government might not be so good at doing that. Mm-hmm. And so if we're not thinking about it, then we might not be able to know, or we might not be able to recognize what's that gap, and be able to then think critically about, well, how do we do this better? For viewers out there thinking about democracy who maybe haven't engaged so much with these questions, most democracies in the world, when we talk about democracy as like in practice, we have a representative form of democracy, right? Based on universal suffrage. There might be some exceptions to that, but eligible citizens have the right to vote, right? We are not living in a time when women don't have the right to vote, or large segments of the population don't have the right to vote. We have representative systems with universal suffrage. That is how we recognize modern democracies today. So what is representative government? In practice, we elect people to govern on our behalf, to make decisions on our behalf. And so even though we're electing people who make decisions on our behalf, if we're not engaged in thinking critically about what are the policy decisions that these elected officials are going to be making on our behalf, then we might not make very informed decisions at the polls.
And then they're going to make decisions on our behalf.
And they're going to make decisions on our behalf.
That we may not like. Right. It's interesting. Well, do you have...
No, I think we can move on. I have a lot of things come to mind when we're talking about representative government, because there's clearly a lot of merit to that, because it's a big unwieldy system, so you can't have kind of direct participation, right? So we need a representative government that, and we might want to skip a question, that functions well. You know? What do you think about our current democratic system? Is it functioning well?
The United States has a really robust democratic system.
Yeah.
We have a vibrant democracy. Yeah. Overall, we have political rights that are protected, universal. We have, the United States has strong protections for civil liberties, all the civil liberties that we went through earlier. That's not to say it's perfect, right? We have a robust system with a strong rule of law system. Mm-hmm. And you know, when you teach, for example, teaching intro to American government or federal government, before you teach about political parties, before you talk about even the branches of government, before you discuss political ideologies of the right or the left, or get into the differences between what you might find on political party platforms, you're going to talk about political culture. Mm. And what is the thing that unites? What is that's that belief in our democratic institutions? What is the culture that underlies our whole system? And in the United States, that political culture is the belief in things like freedom and equality and the right to self-government. Those are the things that are really underpin, that are part of our political culture, that underpin our system. Yeah. And so you can look at that as being like the unifying factor, that the things upon which we can all agree, because it's really the political culture that in the end unites us behind the institutions through which we have representative government. And if you look at, and this I can lean on Freedom House for a bit, the Freedom House will talk about the United States is one of the free countries with a strong democratic system. It doesn't score as high as some democracies in terms of political rights and civil liberties, because it's not perfect. It's got some issues. We look at things like extreme political polarization. We can look at things like gerrymandering, the rise of misinformation and disinformation, rising income inequality. There again, we're looking at what's the gap, what's our ideal, where are we now, and how can we rely on that political culture, the things that unite us in order to improve on these areas. Because I think you see where democracy starts to erode is when we stop believing in our institutions, when that political culture begins to fray and we stop agreeing on the basic
cynicism
tenets that underpin our democracy. Yes, cynicism towards institutions. Mm-hmm.
So freedom is a U.S. American pillar value, right? As you were mentioning, why is freedom such an important value in U.S. American democracy?
That's a great question.
I like freedom.
Who doesn't? I think, and that's the thing, right?
But the freedom, it's an interesting phenomenon, though. It's because it's not self-evident what freedom is all about.
Okay, yes, I think you can unpack some more, because we could get into a deliberation about what does freedom mean.
Let's do it.
Does freedom mean that you have the right to do whatever you want, anytime, any place? Or does freedom also mean, well, again, freedom without any rule of law, right? But there's also, we could have a political discussion about freedom, right? Whereas, does freedom mean you don't have any government intervention, say, for example, in areas of the economy or education, sort of take a more libertarian viewpoint where you have this idea of freedom that is free from restraint, what we could associate as negative liberty, and that it's free from restraint? Or do we see freedom as the right to an education, the right to
healthcare,
the right to feel safe in a community?
Yeah, because ignorance is a kind of unfreedom. If one's ignorant. I mean, as educators, we're kind of like one of our core beliefs. One has to be educated to really exercise freedom, or something like that.
Yes.
Similarly with health, if we're always constantly having to deal with health issues or can't deal with health issues, then that also restricts our movement, our agency, our ability to live fully and freely.
Yes. So this is an important discussion then, right? The negative versus positive freedom, when you freedom from restraint versus the freedom to have and enjoy these things, and really what you were talking about, what I thought is to develop. To develop not only physically as a human being, because you've got proper nutrition and proper housing and proper health care, but also free to develop your mind, to be literate, to be able to think critically. And how important is that to a democracy? So we can look at freedom and say, well, we can even disagree. And that often is a political disagreement. We can disagree about what freedom really means.
Yeah, and one of those disagreements, something we pick a topic every year or every semester and we focus on it, and democracy is what we're focusing on now. That's why you're here, Suzanne. One thing we haven't brought up is in our discussions so far, we've only had a couple of sessions, interviews, but there's a lot of dispute when it comes to, say, freedom to practice religion, and how religious values then conflict on a political stage. And I think that's an important point. I mean, because there are countries in the world that are theocracies that are, combine or fuse together religious ideologies and governing practices. And there's some grounds for saying that Christian nationalism has that kind of pull in the United States historically. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so
freedom of religion is kind of built into our Constitution, right?
Right. So freedom of religion exists as part of the First Amendment.
Right.
And it's two parts. Right?
Yeah.
That the government the government will not establish the Establishment Clause. The government will not establish an official religion or back any one particular religion. That's that separation of church and state doctrine. Right. And the second tenet of the freedom of religion is the free exercise thereof. That you are free to practice your religion, whatever religion that is, without infringement by the government. Again, unless we're talking about certain things that would harm, right? There might be certain religious practices like polygamy, for example, that is not legal in the United States. And with that free exercise, you can practice or not practice. You are free also not to practice a religion. Now, what happens when and this might get into some of the minority questions when you talk about government, when the majority of a people of a country practice a religion, can they impose, out of majority will, could they impose that religion on the population as a whole? Well, our Constitution says that you cannot do that because the protection of civil liberties would mean what we just talked about with the First Amendment rights around religion. So I think that becomes very tricky because religion is, thinking about freedom of expression, religion is often such a part of someone's identity, right? It is one of the key things. In fact, can be one of the key things that socialize us growing up is, were you practicing a religion and how did that form you, and how does it form political beliefs? So it can be a very ingrained thing, and yet this simple question of you could not have the majority impose its will on everybody else. Yeah,
that's a good point, because then that opens up a new kind of horizon of questions because we have majority forces, dynamics that are at work in a democracy that the democracy is ultimately supposed to protect. One protects all peoples, including minorities, perhaps especially.
Right.
Right.
Right, and that's the civil liberties protection.
Yeah.
It's a tension, it's this tension between freedom and freedom of speech and protecting the minorities. Even though we disagree, we value that disagreement. Obviously, I would like to be right and have everything go my way all the time. And if I could, have a magic wand and make everyone follow my way. Also, why is it important, this dissent and that tension, right? Because wouldn't it be easier if I was the queen of the world and everybody did my, and I was able to, everybody agreed with me and I could have my way all the time. I mean, that seems pretty nice. So why is it more important for me to, I disagree with you, but you know what? And you're gonna preside over whatever, right? We're going to do things your way. Why is it more important, for us to learn how to live with that tension and be willing to say, all right, my policies, my arguments didn't win the day, yours did. I disagree. And hopefully next time around, I will put a better argument. And why is it important, to learn how to live with that tension and be okay to take the back seat and let others that I disagree with have their turn?
Yeah, I think the idea of compromise is just critical in a democracy, especially a democracy as large as ours. 330 million or so people in our representative democracy. We're going to disagree. And you were talking about earlier the minority and the majority. So who wins out when we get into fights over things like freedom of speech, abortion, immigration, big issues of the day that we grapple with that end up in the courts or that Congress is making decisions about? I think the ability to be pragmatic and compromise, because dissent is important, and I think it can't be just a few voices who win out all the time. And that's something I try to do in my classes, because sometimes I think, whatever my own political beliefs are, right, I would love everybody to agree. But in a sense, I don't either, because I encourage students to, hey, if you want to push back on something, push back, let's explore it, because there's something maybe to unpack there, and maybe that brings up difficult questions about how do we move forward when we can't agree. And one of the things I'll have my students do is they'll work with different issues, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the issue of abortion, whether it's immigration, guns and gun control. And they'll pick these issues and they'll kind of go through the semester looking at where do the political parties stand? What are the Supreme Court decisions that have come out on this? What are the laws that Congress is passing on this? What could Congress pass on this? And why is it so hard to do that nowadays in our very fragmented political environment? And I think in doing that, they get to deliberate with each other. And that's what I want to create in my classes, is the opportunities to deliberate, because that's a skill. I think that's a skill that we build, to say, this is what I think, what do you think? And then I'll really listen to you and try to understand, because your set of experiences is going to be different than mine. Why do you believe what you do? And the key thing that is important in this, though, is then having proper information, right? Being able to base your decisions and what you're thinking about which direction something should go politically is, are you making the effort to be informed about it? And because if we're living in different realities, it's very difficult to arrive at any kind of compromise.
And if I am such a skilled arguer, right, that I want to push my agenda, and I'm so skilled at pointing out the flaws in other people's points, and I win, what is the danger in that?
Gosh, you bring up a great point. That's something I think about a lot, because if you notice after the debates, it's who won? Who won the debates? Who won? And it's this, and winning's fun. Winning can be fun, and part of the reason we argue, we debate, you can work to win a debate. But I think when the focus is always on winning, it becomes sort of the zero-sum game, right? We lose I think the ability then to see deliberation as a positive thing, that we can argue and we can learn from each other. And maybe win an argument, you might say, oh, I see what you're saying, you kind of won me over to your side, kind of thing. But I think when the focus is always on winning, we can become really locked into our stances and see the other side as the enemy. And I think that focus on winning as opposed to lately I think about the word deliberation is how can I create more of that environment in my class so that we begin to think about how do we deliberate on this? How do we find information on this? How do we critically think about it as opposed to I want to win this argument?
Yeah, that's
it
a
seems
really
very
good point
destructive.
because that's a really good point because on the one hand, the encounter can be understood as a learning exchange, kind of a learning environment, right? And the other one is a last man or last woman standing environment, you know, and you have a domination model and a hierarchical model, you know, with the winning. One always has to win. But I want to come back to a point.
No, not yet. Don't forget it. I want to add one more.
It was a
one
point
more
from
thing.
you, though.
Don't forget it.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought.
Just don't
Write
forget
down.
it. But yeah, you know, because I've won many arguments, and what I've learned is that sometimes it may look like I win, but I end up losing. Insofar as if I'm the most forceful, or the one with the best reasoning, right? The one that I can put the argument together in such a way that, right, I win. I lose out because I didn't get to hear what the other person had to say. And there is value. There might be value, right? I've learned that I'm fallible. I really don't know everything, as much as I'd like to think that I do. And that other person might have a better way of going about things. And if I can just tolerate, there might be something there that benefits everyone, not just me, you know. But and so when I'm so focused on pushing my agenda, even if I win, I end up losing. So there is such value in being able to hear each other out and learn. And I think learning is the ultimate winning. It's a win-win for everyone, right? If we can both learn.
Yeah, and you might still very much sort of have the stronger argument, but it's almost like sometimes, because I struggle with this too sometimes, but I think it's the way I see it is sort of putting my need to save my own pride aside and putting that away and just, what is the other side trying to tell me here? Why do they? Or even trying to understand, even if you're not going to necessarily come to an agreement, understanding, like you said, why? Why do people feel a certain way?
It makes me a weaker person if I win, but I am not aware of my drawbacks, right? Because I didn't let them speak. Please go ahead on that point.
Thank you for letting me speak.
And I think this is a skill we build also, right? We practice these. I think we practice these things. It's like anything.
The part of the practice that I wanted to get to was this issue that in a dialogue or in a process of deliberation, patience is a good sort of virtue that we can cultivate, right? Because even, you know, coming back to kind of more obvious sorts of aspects of our democratic governing system, we've set up our system in such a way that we have things like, well, what if I lose the argument? What if I lose this point? What if you get a policy done that doesn't suit me? Like, what do I do about that? Well, with a little patience, I can learn how to argue better or learn about a policy better. And this is the question I wanted to get to, what do you think about things like term limits and those kinds of built-in structures that kind of limit one party or one person holding power indefinitely? Like, the House of Representatives have 2-year limits. Why do senators have 6-year limits? Why do presidents have 4 and 8-year limits or something like that, right? I think part of it has to do with what Kim was saying, like, what if I lose? You know, what if I lose the day, right? Well, that person's not going to stay in power, right? So at least that's part of it. What do you think?
Yes. Okay. So the thing about term limits, as you were talking about this, I said, oh, okay, well, I was kind of going down the list. The president can serve a maximum of 2 4-year terms.
Right.
A president can serve maximum 8, and it wasn't always like that. There was an amendment added to the Constitution, in the 1940s that said, okay, a president can only serve this long. And
this is enough. You've had like 4 terms.
What's the reasoning for that? Right. Was because we don't want to have a system where someone accrues more and more power, right? We got away from a king a long time ago. We got away from having a monarchy or anything resembling that. So the idea then is that you're limited in how long you can be in power. Because power can amass power, and what's that saying? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the idea was to create guardrails, right, around power.
Right, and we see that actually does happen because incumbents have an incredible amount of power because they have resources, they can distribute resources, they have access that challengers don't. So the incumbents, generally speaking, almost always win.
That's true. They do almost always win. Like over 90% of the time, incumbents in the House and the Senate are going to win, and they can be reelected. There's no term limit. They serve terms.
Then they have to come up for election.
They can be always reelected, and it's true that incumbents always have the advantage. They have resources, they have staffs, they have they basically just accrue resources.
Yeah, but imagine if there was no term limits.
Makes it easy for them to be reelected.
Let's go back to the idea of the king, the philosopher king. Why did we get away from the king? From the absolute monarch. As Hobbes says, I'd rather watch out for one than from everyone, right? So why did we get away from the absolute monarch?
Gosh, well, you as the philosophers, I think, might be able to talk about some of that philosophy that the framers really drew upon when they were creating a system based on the idea of limited government, right? The idea that power wouldn't be arbitrary or in the hands of one or a few. That a system could be ruled by the people and not subject to arbitrary rule. That's the idea of limited government. And I think there is all that political philosophy that was part of the education of the framers who developed the Constitution, the political philosophy that went into this idea that government could be by the people, and that government could be limited, and that the government could exist itself within a legal framework that it also had to abide by. And that's what we see with the protections of civil liberties, right? Those are protections from the government. And so it was a kind of a radical thing, right? For centuries we hadn't, democracy was not the default. And I don't know if it is.
Right.
But to come back to the point that Hobbes makes, and then we have different forms of social contract too, right? Social contract governments, which we are involved in one in the United States, kind of a Lockean, Jeffersonian version of it, right? The lineage or heritage of a monarch shows up in a strong executive, part of a democratic system. So we still have a strong central figure. We can pay attention to how those strong central figures work, but some of them are more like wannabe monarchs, and some of them are more like heads of a council or something. I don't know. I don't even know how to. But I think it's an important point, because in a democracy, if it's ruled by the people, there has to be this kind of strong element of representation, which has to then is in tension often with a strong executive.
Yes, I think it's interesting because the democracy that we have now is different from the democracy we had in 1789, right? There's been lots of changes in a federal government that has expanded in scope and authority since that time. And even monarchs, if we go back and look at history of the British Parliament, even, right, and monarchy exists today as head of state, more symbolic than anything, but there is still monarchy today. But there was a period in the 1700s when there was still very much a central monarch, but where you had a parliament that was developing in authority. So we see iterations through time and these changes. It wasn't just you flip a switch and all of a sudden we have the system we have today. It's been through many changes, but there were these changes happening. And I speak of the British Parliament because that's sort of the direct, the Constitution takes its hereditary line from mostly the British system that the framers were exposed to and drew upon when they were creating the Constitution. And so there was evolution there, right, with more and more people gaining suffrage, for example, and beginning to fight for political rights, and Parliament also would go through changes and be more representative over time, but there was still a monarchy. And then in the United States it was, okay, we do away with the monarchy, but we still have obviously a chief executive that works within the limits of the branches of government and that checks and balances system.
I want to talk about the Magna Carta, right? Even before the 17th century. Just ways that people have figured out too much power in the hands of just one person is not a good idea.
It's not a good idea. Yes.
So even if this was, 500 years before Hobbes, but still people figured out, you can have absolute authority.
And this was the beginning, of some kind of
for everyone's
systems.
benefit here,
Yeah, and here I thought of something that Robert Dahl talks about when he asks why democracy on democracy, and he lists a few things as to why democracy might be better than non-democratic forms of government. And the first thing that he lists in the chapter on why democracy is avoiding tyranny. Because we look at non-democratic forms of government when you have despotic power or authoritarian regimes. We see, if we go back in history, we can look at the extraordinary harm to human beings that some of those systems have caused. And we can look at it in its extreme. Right here we're talking about the evolution of democracy, but that we always think democracy as opposed to what? And non-democratic forms of government can be subject to this whole arbitrary power, rule by the few or rule by the one, that turns arbitrary power that is not based on democratic systems or rule of law.
Yeah, absolute sovereignty is kind of absolute arbitrary tyranny. Right, it's along those lines, right?
Yeah.
We are drawn to truth, and what is the relationship between democracy and truth, right? So we speak about freedom, and then freedom of speech being one of the most central values in U.S. America. What is the relationship between truth and democracy?
Truth and democracy. I think, we talked earlier about the pursuit of truth. And I think, how could we be real about what our system actually is and the ideal that we'd like it to be if we are not actively informed and engaging with the truth? And I think you could probably get into a very philosophical discussion about truth, right, and what truth is, but can we agree, I think, on the evidence and the facts, and what I think to be informed is to pursue the truth. And I don't think we would have a very functioning democracy when truth is no longer something we seek.
I have so this just popped into my head just now, but it's been kind of lurking back there, but this business of truth and information and misinformation and fake news and all that kind of stuff that gets bandied about now, right? And fact checking, right? So what about, we're educators, and one thing about we value as educators is, helping our students understand what's true and what's not true. The big question is, how well does a democracy function if we don't have kind of requisite forms of education in civil understanding, civil behavior, or how governments work? Does one have to have a higher education to be a participating member in a democracy? Where's the lines there? There's a lot of people who don't have much more than a high school degree, and does that disqualify them from being fully participating members in a democracy? Or how does one then, because we don't teach, for instance, in grade school, you don't teach history of Texas government systems or the U.S., international politics or something like that. As we move along, as we move our populace along in educational practices, you get more and more informed. So where's this kind of how do we determine how much education is enough for what we need or something like that?
Right. And to what extent is education just in general going to help with things like civic participation?
Yeah, and it comes back to that
engagement with
issue,
truth,
right?
And so I think there's so much there. But I was thinking about countries that have strong protections of civil liberties have strong protections for freedom of the press.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
And so then we have access to information and lots of alternative viewpoints.
Yeah.
Where we get into trouble is with, alternative facts and living in different realities. And I think that if you look at countries, if we were to get on the Freedom House website and look at the map and look at the countries that are not free, you would find that they do not, in general, they will not have strong protections for freedom of the press, and where misinformation and propaganda are tools often of authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that aspect to it, right? And we have a very robust system of freedom of the press. In fact, it can be very difficult to parse out. And so there's an excellent, you can use things like media bias fact check that will give you not only the political leaning or the partisan leaning when it's getting extreme, because partisan leaning isn't necessarily bad, right? It's just what's the leaning of the ideology, but how factual is it? It'll give you those two dimensions. How factual is it? And so we can use tools to help us sort of rate the sources on which we're basing decisions and information. And I think news literacy and having literacy around how we engage with news and take in information, I think that is a very important part of education, I think. And I think that as educators, I know that's something that I think about, is how can I incorporate, and how, for myself included, this idea of news media literacy and how we're taking in information. And with that, learning how to deliberate. And the whole idea of public education, you brought up that, so I'm trying to stick with the different things that were coming up as you were saying this. Lately we talk about, is a college degree necessary for a good job? We have this discussion, and we find that there are economic opportunities for people who don't necessarily have a college degree.
Right.
And there are, of course, many opportunities for someone with a college degree, but what is also the benefit of a college education? And I think a lot of it is this too, right? The ability to learn how to think.
Yeah. I like your point about journalism, though, because I think it's a strong one, a very strong point, because there is a sizable portion of an electorate that does not have a higher education and won't get one. So where do they get their information? They get them from news sources and journalism. So having a kind of robust, varied free press seems to be essential for serving that need.
Yeah,
right?
I want to move to the next question, but I want to say, if education was not important, then why did we have the US and other countries literacy test at some point, right? I'll just leave it at that. One thing that I like about Suzanne's shaping is she's lived in Europe, she's lived in France and Spain, and at least as far as I know and I can count. So she has a really wonderful global perspective, because a lot of times when we speak about democracy, right, it's very much it's in-house, it's state or just the US, but she also brings a global perspective, and that leads me to my question: how does democracy affect border phenomena? And that is important for us here in La Frontera, right? So from your global perspective that you bring, what do you think about democracy affecting the border?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, because we here live on the border of countries, on the border of cultures, and there's so much a bicultural community. And I think if we just think about the issues, we could just start there and say, well, what are some of the issues that maybe we think about in a more salient way because we're here on the border? Things like immigration, things like immigration obviously has been a big debate with what we've seen recently, and lots of migrants coming across the border or trying to seek asylum. And how do we manage that, and how do we do that in a way, because there are many facets to this, right? We think about human rights, migration. The United Nations talks about in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to seek asylum if you are fleeing persecution of some kind. So we think about human rights. What about security, border security? How many people can you reasonably allow in and integrate and support and help through the immigration process? And I think immigration is an issue that it has so many facets to it. So I think those are issues of trade. Lately there's also talk about the ports of entry, and how do you move commercial traffic from one? How do you move it so that it releases the strain on the neighborhoods that's coming through? So I think there are things day to day that we grapple with, and then there are also these bigger questions of how do we do this, which we're asking as a country, but us here, we just have a front row seat. We are living it because we are part of it.
It reminds me of the song from Leonard Cohen, "Democracy is Coming to the USA."
Yeah. I want to ask the last question.
Okay, you do it.
Yeah, so they're living on the border. Some of the democratic issues are really obvious here, like immigration. You mentioned economics and things like that, and representation. I mean, the kind of ways that democracy works here is different than it works, say, in Dallas or other places in Texas, or we just have a different sort of concentration of people who have different interests, right? But given Kim mentioned your global perspective, so we have this one question that has to do with peace.
Yeah.
Should peace, or is peace, a democratic ideal? I mean, as practicing a democracy, should it promote peace among peoples, or peace among warring constituents, or something like that? What role does this kind of ideal have to play?
So I think there's some interesting points we could probably get into here. But one of them is if you study political science and you get into like political economy, in general, democracies don't go to war with each other. In that sense,
that's a great point.
Democracy is really supportive of peace and peace seeking.
Yeah, that's a great point, right?
So there's that. I think it's Thomas Friedman talks about the golden arches theory, which is when he's unpacking globalization, he talks about the golden arches theory, which is this, that no two countries with a McDonald's are going to go to war with each other. And it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's this idea that we live in a globalized world, and if you, with trade and as connected as we are, if you are interdependent economically, it's mutually beneficial for nobody to go to war. And we live in a very economically interdependent world, but generally, if you look at wars throughout the 20th century, now that doesn't mean democracies don't go to war, but they're not going to war with each other. And part of it ties to the economic systems, which is something we didn't really get into, but typically democracies as we know them today, representative democracies with universal suffrage, are going to exist in countries that have free markets. And free markets, we could look at that too, because there's different iterations of free markets. But free markets can be supportive of democracy because they promote economic growth, are more successful at economic growth, and then having resources to, for example, educate a population. So in terms of peace, then we're talking about systems that largely become stable. And a point about free markets is that you need strong government intervention to have stable free markets.
It's a contradiction, right?
No, that was a great answer. because I think it's important to note that, you know, as philosophers, it's difficult to practice philosophy if you're in a war. You can't sit back and deliberate and reflect and things like that. Similarly, in economics, you need trade routes to be open and for economic exchanges to happen. And you have to agree on the trade policies, right? And that takes conversation and dialogue. And fundamentally, if you have a kind of stable economic system, democratically, people are going to be working, be less unemployment.
And you think about the things the government gets involved in doing, Social Security, unemployment insurance, public education, food safety, drug safety, roads, infrastructure. You think about all the ways, you know, protections in the world of finance, all the ways that government gets involved. We couldn't have, you know, a functioning system without, and in fact, the countries that you see that have some of the strongest rights or political rights and civil liberties also do these things very well.
That's
so
a great
hopefully
point.
we can come to more agreement about the ways that government needs to be involved, because then we have a system that promotes stability and autonomy.
Well, let me just say, I just want to say one last thing about your comment there. Because your point really is that good, strong democracies, right, are where it's at. You know, if we're going to have like peace in the world, we want to develop good, strong democracies.
I don't know. I'm a little cynical about that.
Okay.
So we'll keep talking.
We can ask it off.
And I think we could certainly keep talking because there's so much to unpack here.
All right.
So this has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Kim Diaz.
Jules Simon, join us next time. Thank you very much
Suzanne.
for joining us, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a great dialogue.
Thank you.
Join us next time.